Okay, so we will continue on our journey here with asynchronous JavaScript with discussing promises. And what a promise is basically as the same way as a callback function gets called here after a certain type of data or thing has been computed or a result has been produced. A promise is something that also basically produces a result in the form of either a resolved value or a rejection. So an error if something went wrong. And in a more theoretical context of, or what a promise actually is, it is an object that basically promises to sometime in the future after it has been invoked, so basically called upon, produce either a resolved value or a reason for this value to not be resolved. So basically an error, so a resolve and a reject. And the sometime in the future part is pretty important here because it pretty much defines the third basically state that a promise can be in. So it can either be fulfilled, so it can be the value can be resolved when invoked. It can be rejected, or it can be pending, dependent on how much time it takes for the promise to basically resolve or reject this value after it's been invoked. And when setting up a promise, we basically just create it by setting a variable equal to something we called a promise. So if I create a variable here that I will call, for example, check value, then to set this variable or a constant here rather into a promise, I will begin by typing the keyword new, and then I will type promise like this. And the promise, it takes a function which sets as an arrow function, which basically then is responsible for firing off some code and either return a resolved value or a rejected value, dependent on what happens within this code that we run here. And therefore, this function here within the promise takes two parameters. So it takes a resolved parameter if whatever we have computed in here becomes resolved, and it also takes in a reject, or we usually actually call it a resolve and a reject parameter. And my spelling is not very good, but yes. So it takes in a resolve and a reject parameter. And then it's basically dependent on what we want to do in here. It should this function within this promise should either resolve whatever it is that we want to do and return the value, or reject it and basically throw us an error. So what I will do in here is that I will create a variable, and I will just say value, and I will set this to 1. And then in this function here, I will create an if conditional chain here, or an if-else block, where I want to make a check on this value and then either resolve it or reject it based on this check. So what I want to say here, if this value is not equal to 0, then what I want to then is I just want to call my resolve function here, and then this resolve function here takes a parameter, and this can be basically anything that I want to pass to it, so, or an argument, and I basically just simply, and this is the value that we basically want to return in case this value gets resolved. So then I just want to return here everything went okay, and else if this value here that we set is equal to 0 in this case, then we want to reject this and send back basically just error. Couldn't resolve. And then to basically invoke this promise here, we basically just as the same with a function, basically we call it, so check value, and then what we invoke here is actually we invoke this promise object, because check value is a new promise, which is an object that takes this function here that we have created. And this object also contains a method called then, which is basically a function that takes two parameters, which is basically a success parameter and a failure parameter, and then will return either the success or failure dependent on what happened within our promise here. So what this means is that as the first parameter, and this success parameter and the failure parameter, they're both optional, and they are actually callback functions. And what usually right is that we get a result, and then within this callback function we want to do something with this result. And the next thing here we get an error, and within here we want to do something with this this error here. And what I want to do here is basically that I just want to call a function here that I will call show let's see, we have used show result and show data. I will basically just create a new function here called the show resolve, or we can do here show promise result. And then what this will do here is that it will take the result basically that we will get, which will either be an error or the result here when it's invoked, dependent on what happens here with our promise. And it will basically just console.log out the result, or the thing that's passed to it. And then in here, in check the value, I will basically just call show promise result, and then I will pass it the result here if the promise is resolved. And I will also call here show promise result and pass it the error in case the promise is rejected. And then I will save this. So what happens here when we invoke the promise is that it's going to look at the promise and say, okay, this new promise, it takes a resolve and a reject method here, and it does this test here, and then it sees that if a value is not equal to 0, then we just want to resolve, basically return everything is okay to this first parameter of the then method, and otherwise it wants to reject the value here, so the promise won't resolve, and it will return this error message here instead, and then pass it to the second parameter here of the then method. And then what we do here with our then method is just dependent on here what happens here, if we get a resolved value back or an error back. Dependent on if this promise is resolved or rejected, we will call show promise result, and then if it's resolved, we pass the resolved result here, or if it's rejected, we pass the rejected error here, and then we console log out here whichever thing it is that we get passed. And since value is equal to 1, and now it's not equal to 0, so it should resolve, and we should see that we get this everything went okay printed out on the screen. So if I refresh this, we see that we get everything went okay. And here we can also see that even though this is invoked after we call get data that we created before when we talked about callbacks, the callback here takes 2 seconds, so it ran simultaneously as we invoked the promise here. But since this took longer than this, this result got returned later, 2 seconds later, since this got returned immediately, since we haven't set up any timeouts or anything for this. Okay, but since the promise here is 1, it's not equal to 0, and then it will return everything went okay. If we set this value to 0 though, then we instead we won't resolve it, but we will reject it, and we will pass on this error message instead. And then we would if we pass on the reject, it will take us down here to the second parameter of the then method, and then pass show promise result we recreated here, this error message that we supplied to the reject method here, or to the reject here. So if I save this instead and we refresh this, we can see that we get error, couldn't resolve. And that's basically the way promises work. But I'm going to show one other example where I will simulate more of a real server request instead, using the same type of method that we did here with the callback with a set timeout. And I'm going to show you another way that we can write promises, and that is that we can return promises within function, which is a bit more of a cleaner and better looking and readable way of handling promises. So what I will basically do here is I will create a new function that I will call fetch data, and it will take no parameters, since we're basically just gonna call on this to basically invoke the promise. And what this function will do is that we'll just return a new promise. So instead of setting a promise to a variable like this, like with check value, we make a function return our promise instead. So then what we will do here is just call this function, which basically makes more sense than invoking a promise like this. This new promise we set up in the same way. So we take this function here. And what's interesting too about this is that the resolve and the reject method are actually optional. So you don't need them both. So we could, for example, not bother in handling what would happen if this would reject, since we would get a failure anyways if it couldn't resolve. So we could just pass this basically a resolve method. And then here I will again use the setTimeout function, which belongs to the window object in JavaScript. And the first parameter or argument it takes is this function here. And the second one is the basically time in milliseconds that it will take before it fires off. And for this one, I think I want it to take 3 seconds before it fires off this code. And what I basically want to do here is I want to create a variable that I will call result. And I will call this result here, or I will set this to a string, and I will just say here, data has been retrieved. Well, no data has really been retrieved, but yeah, we're just simulating here what basically how a promise would work in a server request if it would take some time. And then basically if this result here has been resolved, or this variable here has been set, we just want to resolve the result. And we want to do this after 3 seconds has passed. And then basically I would just save this. And what I want to do now is that I'm gonna create another function here that I will just call handle promise. And the only thing I'm gonna do in this function is that I'm gonna call fetch data, which is returning our promise now. And then since fetch data here returns our promise, we can hook onto fetch data the then method, since it returns the promise object. And then as well as the promise, the function that we pass to the promise object here only can take the resolve and doesn't need to take the reject. We don't have to pass both the result and the success and the failure to this then method if we don't want to. We can just pass, for example, the success parameter, which I will show how to do here. So then we basically just pass the result or success, and then we can test this basically here instead by saying if res, so if we get returned something from this promise that we've created here, then I want to console.log the result. And else, if this promise is not resolved, then I want to console.log something went wrong. So this is how we can handle it in another way. And the last thing I want to do is that I basically just want to call this handle promise function. So handle promise like this, doesn't take any in parameters. And what's going to happen now is what we're going to call handle promise. When handle promise is called, it calls the fetch data method, or the fetch data function, which we have up here, which returns this promise that will resolve after 3 seconds with this result. Data has been retrieved. After it has resolved, if it resolves, it will then check if this resolved result is actually resolved, if it contains something, and then if it is containing something, it will console.log the result, or if not, if it wouldn't resolve for some reason, it will console.log something went wrong. So save, and then we refresh this, and OK. And what we got here is we got here data has been retrieved. And we see that it took a little bit of time. It took 3 seconds to resolve. And we could see that the first thing that we got was this first promise, error couldn't resolve, since this didn't take any time. After that, we got here is some data, which is this callback that we created here with the set timeout with 2 seconds. And then the last thing that happened here, after 3 seconds, our promise here in fetch data, in our fetch data function resolved. And we got to return to this data has been retrieved string. And that's basically the way promises work, and how libraries such as fetch and Axios and things that you might run into later, handling server requests, deal with promises. Next up, we're gonna check out the async await keyword.